I'm doing my talk next week on the RSA's new strapline, 21st Century Enlightenment. We have said that the RSA's challenge as an Enlightenment organisation is to revive and reimagine the spirit of the Enlightenment in relation to 21st century opportunities and challenges. But the problem, of course, is can we even agree on the core values of the original Enlightenment, let alone a 21st century version? There may be a general progress around ideas such as reason, progress and liberty, which I think we'd all agree have shaped the world that we live in today, and indeed our very sense of what it means to be human. But the very phrase Enlightenment values still has the potential to open up a firestorm of political and social debate. At incredibly short notice, these three distinguished gentlemen have taken up the invitation with just a few days to come along and share their thoughts. We've asked them to think about which ideas should be salvaged and championed anew, and which should be rejected or reimagined in the light of today's world.
It strikes me as rather strange to want to resurrect Enlightenment values, because there's something about the Enlightenment that is incredibly important, which is that it was the moment or the period in time when people were rejecting truth by authority, the idea that you need to rely on past ways of doing things. It seems to me at the core of the Enlightenment was the questioning of the source of the ideas, so that in particular religious ideas were being challenged by thinkers who suddenly felt liberated from the way things had been done in the past. So in answer to the question, do we need Enlightenment values today? We probably do need some of them, but we don't need them because they're Enlightenment values. We need them because they're independently justifiable ways of approaching the world. Though obviously with the RSA there's a connection with the Enlightenment that we want to encourage. So my Enlightenment value that I want to put to you is religious toleration. This seems to me something that was very central to the early Enlightenment. If you treat writers like John Locke as the beginning of the Enlightenment, his letter on toleration was particularly important in promoting a kind of acceptance of diversity of religion, but it wasn't very broad. It was really just a policy for varieties of Protestantism being tolerated. John Locke, many people don't realise this, but John Locke was not prepared to tolerate Catholics because they're enthralled to a foreign prince, and not prepared to tolerate atheists because you couldn't trust their promises, because they weren't sworn on a Bible or any other religious book. But modern religious toleration, I think, should encompass quite a lot more than that. Obviously, the age we're living in, toleration of atheism, toleration of agnosticism, toleration of a wide range of religions is going to be important for actually as to whether we survive very long into this century. But it shouldn't be confused with respect for religion. That's one of what strikes me as a fallacy that's been going on in the media quite a lot, that toleration involves respect. It does involve some kind of respect, but it's respect for the autonomy of an individual being, an individual person to choose their religion. It's respect for freedom of speech, but it's not respect for religion. We don't have to show respect for whatever it is that we tolerate. What we do have to do is to find our own way through life. So for me, religious toleration isn't about saying yes because somebody is religious, therefore we ought to say, well, that's your religion, I think that's wonderful. I think we should challenge their religion. I think most religions are based on a false premise as a starting point. And most religions are responsible for quite a lot of ill in the world. I actually share some of Bertrand Russell's views on that. But I think we should be tolerating religions. I think there's scope for bringing that Enlightenment value into play in a big way. And I actually rather cheekily think that if the RSA starts taking this seriously, religious toleration will involve challenging the political movement to increase the number of faith schools in Britain. I think that is the most serious threat to a tolerant society that we have today in Britain, by allowing special interest groups to siphon away their children into a particular environment where they are not necessarily indoctrinated, but by law they don't have to teach the range of religious studies that we're legally obliged to in a regular community school, that is a recipe for disaster in my view. And it's absolutely terrifying to see that. I think I'm right in saying that the recent Academies Bill is going to increase the number of faith schools, and there's every sign that the new government, the new coalition, is going to support faith schools. That is something which the RSA could campaign on, could actually add to the debate on. If we're interested in the autonomy of individuals, if we're interested in children actually growing to make decisions for themselves rather than having their views so shaped by their schooling that they aren't equipped to think critically about a range of possible courses in life, then we do need to challenge that. So that's my view about the Enlightenment value that we should be championing today. It's religious toleration that includes toleration of people who aren't religious and actually looks at the ways in which the state is somehow encouraging religious segregation rather than religious diversity and acceptance of other ways of living. Thank you.
Hard to be against Enlightenment, isn't it? And if you think about the 18th century, which is the period most associated with the Enlightenment, in a sense, takes place in the face of forces of darkness, lack of tolerance, such as Nigel's described, but also forces of superstition, pre-scientific belief that wasn't particularly helpful to the construction of a successful society. So at one level, it's very hard to be against Enlightenment, and Enlightenment as the light of reason is clearly something that the RSA and good-natured people will want to support. So at face value, Enlightenment is something that's hard to argue with, but I'm going to argue with it anyway, because I think Enlightenment carries with it some risks, and against it I'm going to oppose a notion of, for the sake of argument, endarkenment. Now, there are two axes along which we need to suspect Enlightenment. One is the axis of trust, and one is the axis of creativity. And I'll talk about both trust and creativity very briefly, and why Enlightenment threatens both trust and creativity. So trust, first of all. Now, in terms of Enlightenment, probably the most salient inflection of Enlightenment in the current political moment is that of transparency. You can't move for people talking about transparency these days. I went through the various party manifestos before the election, and they all cite transparency. The Conservative Party manifesto cited the term 37 times. So it's clearly in the air, this notion of transparency. So transparency, in a sense, is a modern inflection of what Enlightenment is. But I think we have reason to be very sceptical about this notion of transparency, and I'll explain why. Transparency and trust are often taken, if not as synonymous, as certainly complementary terms. So we think that if we have a more transparent society, it will abet and induce trust. So to take a classic example, if in the banking sector we impose more rules of accountability and transparency is achieved among financial services firms, we think we'll be able to trust them more because we'll be able to see what they're up to. So accountability, trust, transparency apparently go together. In fact, I think the opposite is the case. Think of it like this. If I can see everything you're doing, I've got no need to trust you. Right? I can see it, so the demand for trust placed upon me is removed. I put that in terms of a personal relationship. If you trust your husband or wife, that means you don't need to watch them all day long. You trust them precisely to go out and do things that you would approve of, more or less, without you having to supervise them, right? So trust and transparency are actually opposites rather than complementary values. You only begin to trust, as it were, when darkness falls. It's only when you can't see that trust is called upon. When you can see everything, you don't need to trust. So trust and blindness go together, hence the phrase blind trust. So blindness and trust are more compatible, more closely related than trust and enlightenment. So if we are moving towards a culture of greater and greater transparency, we are moving further and further away from a culture of trust. In a mature society, we'll be able to trust people not to have the spotlight on them all the time, and this would be an advance. The current obsession with Enlightenment in terms of transparency, after all, is a corrective to the fact that we fear or have feared the obfuscatory or dark dealings of banks and so on in the past, and we talk about transparency as a corrective to that. Well, as a corrective it might be fine, but it can't be a destiny. We need to get to a place where there is more darkness and we can trust people to do their thing. Right, that for me is a sign of a mature society. Then in terms of creativity, now Enlightenment, particularly in the 18th century, is very much associated with reason, and the light of reason, as I say, is a very dominant metaphor. Throughout the history of thinking, reason and light go together. It borrows also a lot of association from religious language and revelation and so on. But there's also a sense in which Enlightenment is the enemy of creativity, just as it's the enemy of trust. And this is because there is something about creativity which is non-rational, which is not brought into the light of reason, which needs to be left on its own in private to develop and to grow by itself. If you apply the values of Enlightenment to creativity and innovation, you kill it, because you have to make it accountable before it's had a chance to grow. So again, we need to be much more skeptical about what this notion of enlightenment might actually be. It could be that very thing which prevents good irrationality from prevailing. And I distinguish between good irrationality and bad irrationality. Good irrationality is creative thinking. Bad irrationality is madness. But we need some good irrationality, because it's from good irrationality that we get ideas, we get creativity, and we get innovation. So, am I in favour of enlightenment? Well, yeah, in the sense that you can't be against it. But I think a far more mature notion would be one of what I call endarkenment, which is allowing enough darkness for us to trust people and to mature as a society. And secondly, allowing enough darkness for us to be able to allow innovation to grow up in the shadows, which is where innovation begins. Thank you.
Well, there always has to be one misery guts at an oxygen session of this kind, lunchtime at the RSA, the believer in the adage that misery loves company, the Grinch, who reacts to talk of enlightenment with, yes, but what about the countertrends? What about the bad moons rising? Why did I choose misery? Not because I'm of a miserable mind, not because I like putting wrinkles on faces where there ought to be dimples. I'm aware that there are many inspiring, uplifting, as Matthew said in his introduction, legacies of enlightenment. By the way, the term is a 19th century term. It's an anachronism. Contemporaries didn't speak about the age of enlightenment. Kant is really an exception. And keep in mind, too, that the Enlightenment, the phrase and talk of the Enlightenment in the 19th century was often by its enemies. These are complications. But the fact is that despite all the regional and temporal variations, Enlightenment, this period, for example, the second half of the 18th century, was a black swan moment when many things happened, when a different future began to be imagined, a new language was developed to understand the world differently and to change it for the better. There are lots of examples of this. For example, the rise of political economy as a discipline in Scotland, the advantages of the market, religious toleration, we've heard about Voltaire and others, the very modern concept of civil society and the ideal of a civil society is born of this period. Much talk of public opinion. It's the period in which the novel is created. The first daily newspaper happens and there are pamphlet wars. Words like democrat, a Dutch neologism, happened in this period, and a remarkable theory of representative democracy that the ancients didn't know. I understand all of this, but I want to speak about misery, because I want to suggest to you that the Enlightenment, this second half of the 18th century, was also deeply preoccupied with misery. It's a word that came from the Old French, miserie, and it came from the Latin to mean wretched, and it had connotations of to pity someone who was living in wretchedness. You will find in Enlightenment writings, including those very close to the RSA, in the last quarter of the 18th century, lots of references to misery. Dr. Johnson's first full-scale English dictionary reflects upon the meaning of misery as unhappiness that comes from a gap between what we aspire to and what we're currently living. Adam Smith does much the same. There was a whole, in other words, philosophical discussion about what misery was. There were people like Benjamin Franklin who thought that misery was the revenge of God upon the lazy, which I'm not sure of what the current RSA policy is. Blue sachants, perhaps, but that was a joke that fell flat. Burke.
No, we were just thinking about it.
Yes. Burke, in a misery, 9 parts in 10 of the whole race of mankind drudge through life. Tom Paine, and so on. I mean, there are many, many references to the problem of misery. That is, to real-world obstructions, barriers to the attainment of some of these good ideals. I want to give 3 examples. I think they all have 21st century resonance. It's too late for Matthew to change his text, but they go something like this. The 3 just hand-selected examples. Despotism. It's a new term invented by Montesquieu, published 1751. A new modern type of rule which is kind of crazy, which disorders people's lives, a form of non-government, a form of power which feeds upon lies, violence, fear, and mistakes, and ultimately hubris, and brings ruinous consequences to people's lives. This idea, it seems to me, has continuing relevance despite what has just been said about the need for darkness. It seems to me that if you look at the origins of the collapse, near collapse of the banking and credit systems that brought us almost to a Great Depression, you will see that the core cause of this is the lack of openness, of transparency, of accountability. And if you want to understand the disaster that is called Deepwater Horizon, have a look at last Monday's New York Times, where there is an account of the complete failure of the regulatory structures. That is the ultimate cause of a disaster of this kind. That was an 18th century idea. Second example, the problem of violence and war. Sir Michael Howard, in a wonderful small book, has pointed out that the Enlightenment invented the ideal of peace. We think that's always been around. That's not so. There are many, many reflections on the problem of war and violence. Kant's essay on perpetual peace is a case in point. Burke's attack on Warren Hastings, governor of Bengal. Think of Swift's wonderful satire on Irish poverty, that one way the Irish could lift themselves out of poverty is that the poor could sell their babies as flesh to the rich of ladies and gentlemen of England. We are living in times in which these problems are still with us. A flourishing arms industry, lots of paradoxes. Britain happens to be among the most transparent territorial states on the face of the earth in the sense of publishing flowcharts and so on, details, but there are a lot of anomalies. For example, the latest CIPRI documents show that some 60,000 small arms entered Britain last year, although Britain claims that there are no imports of arms. So where exactly are they coming from, and to where do they go? There is, of course, a continuing problem about incivilities in daily life, violence against children. These were themes of the 18th century Enlightenment. And finally, poverty. You may know that if you've heard, of course, making poverty history, that's an Enlightenment ideal. The whole notion that poverty could be abolished was a product of this period. Think of Tom Paine, the contrast of affluence and wretchedness, continually meeting and offending the eye as like dead and living bodies chained together. Well, you know that there is not only a deep-seated problem of poverty in this country, it's going to grow worse. A child born in Carlton, south area of Glasgow, has a life expectancy of 54. Those born in Lenzie North, much more affluent, have a life expectancy of 82, and so on. Finally, 2 questions for Matthew and the RSA as you pursue 21st century Enlightenment. I'm wondering, in all the discussions that will happen, whether there were blind spots in the 18th century Enlightenment. That is to say, things that have come to cause us misery, that they took to be unproblematic. I think there are many examples of this, the representation of women. Adorno and Horkheimer, famously German scholars, picked on the Marquis de Sade as a kind of a monstrous example of Enlightenment representations of women. Or think of the doctrine of national self-determination. That crystallized in the 18th century, and it came to produce many wars and much bloodshed in Europe and elsewhere. And finally, I'm wondering about the counter-Enlightenment. This was a term famously coined or developed by Isaiah Berlin. There were a lot of critics of Enlightenment who gathered against the principles of Enlightenment. Can anything be learned from this counter-Enlightenment? Isaiah Berlin's view is that there are many paradoxes in all of this, and there are indeed some things that can be learned, and I'm about to finish. And an example is that the counter-Enlightenment, typically against the fetish of reason, of arts and manufactures, had a kind of vitalist, organic, pro-biosphere, as we would say now, view of the world. And I think that when we look at things going on in the 21st century, maybe this counter-Enlightenment theme, that human beings are full of hubris, that we abuse our powers vis-à-vis nature, maybe that idea is an idea that will flourish in the 21st century. Let us hope so. Thank you very much.